Well, thank you, Jerry. It's so great to see you. And it's so great to see all of you. Everybody, can you guys hear me okay? And you can see my screen, I hope, that the cover slide.
Yes, you're good.
All right, we're good. So I guess first of all, I wanted to acknowledge Gardner and Seth for your accomplishments and your awards this evening, and the rest of you that have finished the program and graduated. And it's so exciting to see some faces that I recognize and so many interested faces and people in the program. So I'm so happy to be here tonight. And I work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of the Atlanta regional office, and my primary job is doing listings, downlistings, delistings, all related to the Endangered Species Act. And so I wanted to share some information with you guys to help you better understand what the endangered species is and how the species are put on it and how they're taken off of it, and how you can participate in the process. So just to make this fun and interactive, I was hoping to kind of poll you guys and see if you know of any species in Louisiana that are on the endangered species list. So if you guys wanted to chat something in the chat box, and we'll take a look and see what we have here. Let's see. So I have
so we've got some red cockade. Oh, we have a bunch. We have a bunch.
Awesome.
Louisiana black bear, red cockaded woodpecker, pine snake, bald eagles, whooping crane with a question mark, gopher tortoise, least tern.
You guys are awesome. That is so impressive. So, and a few of those we're actually going to have in some of our pictures tonight. So I created the slideshow keeping it in mind that I always like to try and identify the species. So I left the species name blank until the end of the slide. So you're welcome to either, if you know it, put it in the chat box, or just have fun and try and figure out if you know what species they are. So here on our introductory slide, we have the Rufa red knot, which is a threatened species, and the Louisiana pine snake, which is also, let's see, Louisiana pine snake is a threatened species, and the American chaff seed, which is an endangered plant. I want to make a disclaimer though. So all of my images that are on this presentation were taken from Fish and Wildlife Service websites or documents. And I've noted in the image if I got them from somewhere else. So I just want you guys to be aware that I am acknowledging my sources. Also, when I'm probably going to say we a lot. And when I say we, I'm more than likely referring to the agency that I work for, the Fish and Wildlife Service. So if I ever use that term and it's confusing what that means, you can flag or put something in the chat and I'll make sure I clarify. Another thing is I'm not a species expert. I am a wildlife biologist, but I'm not an expert on all of these species, but I do get to work with experts who know a lot about these species. So let's see, so that makes it really exciting. And yeah, so what I know most about is the policy and the process for listing these species and deciding how we decide which species to consider. So we're just going to quickly go through the Endangered Species Act. That's going to talk a little bit about the history, a little bit about policy. There's some biology. And so I'll try not to make it too boring. So we'll go through this. And if you have any questions, I'm going to stop every now and then, see if there's any questions, but feel free to put something in the chat if you have something that needs to be addressed. We're going to go over a little bit of terminology in the Endangered Species Act, the listing process, which is what I know most about, and what does that mean? How do we put these species on a list and remove them? And then also what's important to me is informing the public how they can participate in this process. So our process is intended to be transparent, and we invite public involvement and hope that we get public involvement through the process, but not everybody knows how to do that. So I'm hoping to help inform you. And then I have a slide that can give you some links if we don't get that far today. And just to give you a little background where I work, I am in the Atlanta regional office with a star there. These are our interior regions for the different Department of Interior agencies. And I work for both the area that's got the number 4, the Mississippi Basin, which is where Louisiana is, and also the South Atlantic Gulf, which is the Southeast US, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service, it sounds like you guys have Joanne in your program now who works with refuges, and that's wonderful to hear. So, and you've already been to Bayou Sauvage, it sounds like. So that's one of the refuges within the Fish and Wildlife Service. We have refuges, we have a migratory birds program, we have an aquatics program who has, they have fish hatcheries across the country. And I work for the Ecological Services Program. And so this is just a few, just a small list of things that we do, but I particularly do the endangered species portion and implementation. And so when I started putting this together, you know, I was thinking how confusing it is when people refer to threatened and endangered species. Like that could mean, what do you mean? Are you talking about the international list? Are you talking about the state list? And I just Googled threatened and endangered species list, and I found, like, here's the International Union for Conservation of Nature. They have a list that's the global red list. And so that one looks at species across the globe and tries to address habitat loss and conserve nature. I found another one for the World Wildlife Foundation, which is a nonprofit. So they have their own list and their own definitions and what those species mean. And each state usually has its own list. And so they may call it rare, threatened, and endangered species. Here's a clip from the Louisiana Department of Fish and Wildlife's website that shows how they have things categorized. And each one of those terms may mean something different for each one of these organizations. And then we have the endangered species list, which is a component of the Endangered Species Act, which is overseen by both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS. So depending on where your species is, if it's offshore or if it's terrestrial, one of those two agencies will be implementing this and managing this endangered species list for threatened and endangered species. This is our homepage to the Fish and Wildlife Service endangered. If you type in fws.endangered, you can get all the information you want about currently listed species, you can pull up a copy of the endangered species list yourself. If you have any questions about, you know, what if you have an endangered species on your property, what do? You can find it here on this website. So the Endangered Species Act came about because back historically, several hundred years ago, when settlers came over, they just thought they had endless amounts of animals they could hunt. And this is a species that was just neglectfully overhunted. And you can see here on the right that the person standing on the mound is a pile of these species the birds that had just been killed. There were foraging on crops as people, agriculture expanded. Their habitat was getting removed as people were moving into the country, and so they were getting persecuted for doing what birds do and going out and eating. Well, little did people pay attention, and they soon realized, that there's none left, and so so a lot of people started getting concerned about how, we don't want this to happen to other species. Same thing was happening to this tall white bird that is found in Louisiana and some parts of the southern US. And people like their feathers. So they had these beautiful, intricate feather hats. And so these birds on the ground are sometimes easy to catch and easy targets for these 1800s intricate ladies' hats. And so it started decimating populations. You guys probably know these species, the passenger pigeon and the whooping crane. So, and you guys are lucky enough to have the whooping crane still in Louisiana as an experimental population, and I can talk about that in a little bit. So yeah, it was back in the early 60s. People really started getting concerned. Even before that, people started getting concerned, and then in 1966, the Congress said, well, we need to go ahead and do something and act now. So they created this precursor to the Endangered Species Act, and it was called the Endangered Species Preservation Act. And so it protected species, and then allowed for the first the first list of species. So species were identified and put on this list in 1967. And that included 17 species. And one of the very first ones that was on that list was the American alligator, because it also had suffered from overharvest and over hunting, over collecting because of the meat and because of the hides. And let's see. And then a few years after that, the Endangered Species Conservation Act was established. And let's see here. And let's see. So in 1972, President Nixon, he took it upon himself. He felt concerned that the precursors to the Endangered Species Act wasn't providing enough protection, and some federal agencies were still able to go out and do work without paying attention to their impacts, and it just wasn't cutting the mustard. So Congress passed the Endangered Species Act in 1973, and it passed, like, everybody was on board, both sides of the fence. Everybody wanted that same protection, so that you can see in the Senate, no one was against it, and the House, only a few people were against it. So people recognized that it was much needed and good timing. And that new law, or this new statute that was established, the Endangered Species Act, provided that endangered and threatened species would be protected, and also their habitat where they live. And so that provided protections for maybe nesting areas for the sea turtles, and also protect species from overhunting or any other impacts that might excessively remove or reduce populations. So here we have our loggerhead sea turtle, and they do build nests on the Louisiana coast. And let's see, the loggerhead is currently a it's both endangered and threatened, but the population that's in the North Atlantic is threatened right now. And the federal agencies, like I said, after this new act was passed, they required, well, they had to be more careful and thoughtful with when they were doing activities that might affect these species. And so there's requirements for federal agencies that they have to be attentive to where the species are and where the habitats for these species are. And if they're conducting any activities within the areas that might impact the species, they actually have to go through a consultation process that is trying to figure out how much of an impact, and are there ways that they can alter their plan but continue working. Endangered Species Act. It's not very long. It's a pretty short document, and it's pretty to the point. And it's amazing that way back in 1973 they were able to pull this together and with such few words, but it's so powerful and it has so much meaning. And the sections that I'm mostly going to cover are the ones that are in red. And section 4 is the section of the statute that focuses on threatened and endangered species and how they're determined. And so that's what I know the most, and so that's what I'm going to focus on the most. We also, and just a quick summary about what all of those different sections mean. It outlines the process for listing species as threatened or endangered. It requires the determination of critical habitat, which is something else I'll talk about. It's basically important habitat for the species that also has protections to prevent future loss of the species. And if a species is listed, then there has to be some sort of recovery plan that's published, and there's a plan to figure out how the ultimate goal is to get the species off of the list so that they have recovered. And so the recovery planning provides monitoring and the plans, ideas for how to conserve the species. It also gives financial assistance to states and territories. The territories are Puerto Rico, US Virgin Islands, and Guam, some others. And this is what I was talking about earlier. The federal agencies have to avoid what's called jeopardizing the listed species. So that's where they're consulting to make sure that they're not going to negatively impact the species such that it will continue to decline. It also informs, it describes what is not allowed, like what you can and can't do if you're dealing with a threatened or endangered species. And it also talks about what is allowed and how you can go about getting permits if you needed to do work, but you might affect the species. And then of course, if you don't play by the rules, there's penalties. And so it does provide that the penalties and enforcement, because it's a federal statute, those apply, and they apply across the board. So we'll start here with just a few terms that seem like it should be easy, and but it's really, these can be convoluted, and there's been lots of court cases to further explain the different interpretations of these. But within the Endangered Species Act, the term endangered, the endangered species are any species in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. That last part of the sentence is a little bit of a caveat that we have to pay attention to when we're considering listing. But it's basically any species that's in danger of extinction now. Threatened species are any species that are likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. And that's where that, sometimes terminology can be interpreted in different ways. And so the foreseeable future could be different time periods for different species. It sort of depends on the threats, how imminent the threats are, maybe how many individuals there are, or maybe the range is shrinking. There's a lot to factor in, and we look at now, and then we look into the future to see how we think the species will respond to threats and conservation measures. And conserve, that's another easy one, but we still, we have to follow what's in the Endangered Species Act, and it basically, and it's our ultimate goal, is to use all the methods and procedures necessary to bring an endangered or threatened species to the point at which the measures provided under the Act are no longer necessary, and they're removed from the endangered species list. That's our ultimate goal. And critical habitat, I mentioned earlier, it is also defined in the Act, and it's certain specific geographic areas that are essential to the conservation of a threatened or endangered species. And there's certain features that the species need that have to be in that critical habitat, or essential to the species survival. So here we have the pink mucket at the top here, and it is a species, it's the mussel species. It's endangered. It's found throughout the Tennessee, Cumberland, and Ohio River drainages, and it's also been found down in the Missouri River, Black River, and Mississippi rivers. So that species is declining and listed as endangered, as is the West Indian manatee, which used to be endangered up until about 2 years ago, and it was what we call downlisted, moved from endangered to threatened. So that's exciting. So that's what we want. But it indicates that there's still some work to do in order to improve populations enough where we can completely remove it. The classification and recovery is, like I said, in the section 4 of the statute. It talks about the classification process. How do we identify how we don't just randomly select species to determine their status? There's a process, and there's I'm going to talk you guys through that process here in a little bit, but it talks about the classification, that's listing, that's downlisting, that's delisting. And then once a species is listed, it's got to have all the plans to go towards the conservation and the recovery. So we're required to publish recovery plans. Once the species has been on the list for 5 years or more, we're supposed to do a 5-year review and evaluate the status again. And then once it has recovered, we delist it, remove it from the list, but we still continue monitoring to make sure that we're not at that threshold where the species is going to continue to decline. So someone said the Louisiana black bear. That's awesome. That's one that recently was taken off of the endangered species list because it did recover. So, and then the next little species is a piping plover. You can see these guys down at Grand Isle. So if you go down, you can see the little piping plovers occasionally, and that species is currently listed as threatened. Some of the populations are endangered, but the population that you would see along the Louisiana coast is more than likely the threatened population. Let's see. So yeah, so who is eligible for listing? Like what can we just, we have to follow these specific descriptions. There's species, there's subspecies, and for plants, that also includes plant varieties. And there's also what's called a distinct population segment, and that NIMS calls it the evolutionarily significant units, and those are portions of the entire species that are valuable enough to the species whole that must be protected. And sometimes they're split into these population segments. Let's see. So I wanted to include an arachnid. I couldn't find a spider that was listed in Louisiana, so I did find this Kokendulfer cave harvestman. So this is from Texas, and so there's a series of these harvestmen and invertebrates that were found in some caves in Texas that people were very surprised to find them, and they didn't find very many of them. So a lot of these got clumped and packaged up together and listed. This one is endangered. And of course, the eastern black rail, that's another cool bird that's along the Louisiana coast. That one is a subspecies, as you can tell by the name. And that one is threatened. That one was only put on the endangered species list about, I think it was last year sometime. So that one, that little bird has, yeah, it's got quite some challenges. I love those birds. And the green sea turtle is another one that you might find off the coast in the Gulf of Mexico. That one is a distinct population segment. And that one is the North Atlantic distinct population segment is threatened. Another thing that we have to do to make sure, I said, this is a transparent process. We want involvement. We want the states involved. We want tribes and other federal partners, the public. So we are mandated to work with the states throughout the whole process. Well, in certain steps of the listing process. So, and recovery process. So this is an example of a species. We coordinate with the states in lots of different capacities. We work with them on grants and funding to help survey and monitor species. They help us, before a species is listed, it's called an at-risk species. And so quite often the states will do surveys and conservation efforts to protect those at-risk species so that they don't make it so that they are conserved, that they don't have to be listed. So there's a lot of coordination. And this species, this is a good example of, you guys know this one. I shouldn't even have to show this, but the brown pelican, you probably have heard the story about the DDT and pesticides that were in becoming an issue, or awareness of those issues people became aware of those issues and started really paying attention. Some of our raptors and the pelicans, their eggs were very fragile and just crumbling because of some of these toxic chemicals. And believe it or not, in Louisiana, the brown pelican almost disappeared. Like they were saying, I was reading, let's see, in 1920, brown pelicans were estimated, and this is in Louisiana, to have numbered between 50,000 and 85,000. By 1963, the brown pelican had completely disappeared from Louisiana. So it took reintroductions from other areas in Florida to move some birds back to Louisiana. And that took partnerships with lots of different organizations and agencies to monitor those birds that came back and see how well they bred. And you guys are aware of some of the island nesting issues. So the state still continues to monitor brown pelicans off the Louisiana coast to make sure that that we're not losing them again. So, and then also the federal agencies, we also have to ensure that we're cooperating with some of our federal partners. That could be anywhere from Department of Energy to this particular case that I have here on the screen is it was a partnership with the Department of Defense. And but we need to coordinate with them through lots of different we may work with them to develop management plans, or possibly when they're planning activities that could affect the species, we work with them to help figure out a good method to allow the work to continue but reduce the impacts on the species. So I think I already talked about the consultation that's required. So the other federal agencies and even Fish and Wildlife Service, if we were to do any activities that disturb or take these listed species, we do have to walk through what we're going to do and how that might affect the species. Let's see. And so this is a red cockaded woodpecker. This, I don't know if you guys have been up to, like, outside of Mandeville, there's the Fontainebleau State Park and the Big Branch okay, good. Yeah, Big Branch Marsh National Wildlife Refuge. And last time I was up there, I looked and I couldn't see any birds, but I could see some of the cavities. So when you guys go up there, look for these red cockaded woodpeckers. They're currently endangered, but they're under review. So, and you might see one of these little signs up there. So what does it mean when a species is listed? Well, what can you do? What can't you do? Well, it's this is another one of those definitions that were provided that is really broad, and what you can't do for endangered animals is what's called take. And take is defined as harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect or attempt to engage in any of these activities. And that can mean on purpose or even accidentally because of the terms harass and harm. So there are, it applies to everybody, all the states and federal agencies, as well as individuals. So this is a huge step at protecting the species from especially intentional harm. But sometimes unintentional or incidental take can also affect the species. So we'll talk about that. It also prohibits import, export, interstate transport, possession, or sale. And that this prohibitions are in the Section 9 of the Endangered Species Act. Section 8 talks a little bit about our international coordination, and that's where we have to document exports of these certain species, and that's part of the that's part of the ESA regulation. So let's see, and then these same prohibitions also apply to threatened species, and the threatened species used to have all these same protections, but as of about 2 years ago, these protections were taken away from threatened species. So now if we if we list a species as threatened, we must create its own specific rule that talks about what's not allowed and what is allowed. So that's called a 4D rule. And I'll talk about that, or if you guys have questions about that, I can talk about that later. Plants have a little bit of different prohibition language. So there's actually no take for plants. There is, let's see, on federal lands, you can't remove or reduce to possession. You can't intentionally affect the plants. If you were to accidentally step on one, it's not considered take as if for an endangered wildlife species. And there's still no interstate sale, import, or export, and that protects these plant species from people collecting them and propagating them for distribution. Let's see. So what can you do? Because that seems like an awful lot of room for error. So if you plan to work on any of these listed species, or even if you're working on some species that might overlap with some listed species, where you may accidentally affect one of the listed species, you can apply for a permit. And that's through the Fish and Wildlife Service. That's Section 10 of the ESA. The permits are given out to, of course, our captive breeding facilities and zoos, researchers. Or you can also get permits if you're a private landowner and you have a listed species on your land. There are these agreements that we work with the landowners to try to reduce impacts to these listed species. And you can get a permit. Here's another habitat conservation plan. If you have a habitat conservation plan as a private landowner, you can get a 10A1B permit, but that's a little detailed. So what happens if you accidentally or intentionally don't comply with our regulations here, or if you're intentionally caught maybe trapping or fishing for illegal or for endangered species, there's some pretty high penalties, and you see cases like that in the news all the time where people are found with endangered species in the back of their car, packaged up in boxes that they're trying to smuggle. So it's good that we have these high penalties, and law enforcement is aware and always looking for illegal activity. But if you're just a citizen and it was an incidental, if something happened, and you accidentally impacted one of the an endangered turtle, you're not likely to see these kind of penalties, but they do exist, and for a good reason. Okay, does anybody have any questions right now? I have a few more slides to go through the listing process.
So we did have two of the Joanne and Becky, who are both affiliated with the Big Branch National Wildlife Refuge, about the red cockaded woodpeckers. And so
Awesome.
Look in the chat. Becky has specific directions on where to find the red cockaded woodpecker, and Becky listed her address. In addition, Joanne told us that we can locate the trees with a white ring of paint, which I never knew.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you guys. That's that would have been helpful. That would have helped me when I was looking. Are there any other questions right now? We'll keep going, and I may just speed through some of these.
That's good. We're good.
Okay, so for the listing program, this is what I do mostly, and that goes back to that section 4 of the statute in the Endangered Species Act. So this is how we get the species on the list and the process for figuring out if they're threatened or endangered, or maybe they're not either, and maybe they're doing better than people thought. So it first starts off with the Fish and Wildlife Service receives a petition, and that petition can come from anyone. So the public can send us a petition, and that petition there's some requirements that must go in that petition, but it needs to supply sufficient information on the species. Maybe you're an orchid enthusiast and you've been studying these orchids in the wild, and you've been noticing that they're declining. Maybe there's a shopping center going in an area where you've seen the orchids, and that's a good purpose to petition us, to have us that on the radar and have us take a look at that species. Once we receive a petition, we will make a 90-day finding. The clock starts ticking. We have 90 days past that, the day we receive the petition, to publish the results from our finding. And so I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. And all of this is spelled out in the Endangered Species Act. So we're supposed to follow these timelines. Species can be put on the candidate list, and I'll go over that as well. And then this little bee is the Gulf Coast solitary bee. We received a petition on this species last year, and we published the 90-day finding. It was a little over 90 days, but we did get it published saying that there was sufficient information that we will be conducting a 12-month review to determine if it's warranted. So you guys keep your eyes out for that. You'll be seeing that soon. Well, in the next few years. The petition process, this is where you can be involved. You can submit a petition. It starts that 90-day clock where we have to review it, the information in it. And then our standard for the reviewing those, we're looking at it from an outside perspective, and if any reasonable person would think that there's sufficient information in that petition that the species could be warranted. And we're not looking at it as species experts or academic viewpoint. We're trying to look at if a reasonable person would think that this species, the action to further 12-month finding would be warranted. So if there's not enough information, it's called not substantial. If there is sufficient information, the species looks like it's in danger or it's at risk, then we call that substantial. And we publish those findings so the public is aware of what came out of that petition, so you can know what to expect for that species. And it sounds pretty silly, but we have received petitions on Bigfoot. So someone thought he had enough information, and he submitted a petition, and he brought evidence where he was sure that Bigfoot exists. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but we had to go by what was in the petition, and there was not enough sufficient information to make a determination, so it was not substantial. We've also received a petition on Homo sapiens. So someone was concerned that our species was declining and petitioned us maybe about 20, 30 years ago. And that one also, we didn't find any reason to believe that we're at risk right now. So that one was also not substantial.
Okay, you have a question in the chat asking, how many petitions do you get in general from year to year?
That varies. We used to get petitions that included, they're called mega petitions, and some of them include about 400 or 500 species. And so by law, we have to evaluate every one of those on the petition. And so that very thing has backlogged our whole process, and we're not always within our 90-day time frame or our 12-month time frame. Even though we're really trying, we are just jammed up with these species that we have to review. I think last year our region, I think we received one. Yeah, we received one for the Florida torreya, which is a species down in Florida. Highly endangered, and someone wanted it moved from endangered to threatened. And so we're currently reviewing that petition. Good question. Let's see here. And this is another one that we just got this on Monday. So we received a petition on Monday. I say we, the Fish and Wildlife Service got this petition for the, I want to show you the species name there, the American bumblebee. It's a wide-ranging species across much of at least the eastern US, as far as I know. And so the clock, I don't know where we are in this petition. What happens is the petition is submitted, headquarters, someone at headquarters goes through the material, makes sure the material, the package has enough information that's required, and then they assign it to a biologist or a certain office within the species range. I don't know which office is going to get to review this petition, but this is another one that you guys can keep an eye on. You should be seeing your petition 90-day finding in the next few months if we can get to it. And I did include, share a copy of that petition with you guys that that you should have access to at the end of this presentation. And like I said, we do publish those 90-day findings, and this is the document. This is what it looks like. It's published in what's called the Federal Register. The Federal Register is like it's our public notification board of where all of our rules, everything that we're going to turn into a regulation, or any regulations that are changed, we publish it in the Federal Register so the public has access to that. And if we do find that there's enough information, we have to do a 12-month finding. And this is the part that gets fun. So we conduct a species status assessment. So we pull together all the biology, all the information that we can on the species, and compile it and do some analyses on what the abundance estimates and the species range. We describe the taxonomy, the habitat, life history. We look at how the species is doing now and how we expect the species to be in the future in light of all the threats that we identify. And let's see, so yeah, this is one that we just did a species status assessment on recently, the monarch. And that one was found, the 12-month finding on that one, the species was found warranted, but precluded. And I'll talk about that. That's where it becomes a candidate, and it's in a holding pattern until we can determine if it's threatened or endangered. And this is an example of that species status assessment that's publicly available now for the monarch. So you could go online and look this up and find this and take a look. I'm happy to send you guys a copy of this as well. And through this process, we're still engaging with our partners, making sure people have input. We work with species experts to make sure we're using the best available science. And then it's peer reviewed too. So it's a peer reviewed, scientifically sound document. Once we do that species status assessment report, then management up in the chains of Fish and Wildlife Service and and National Marine Fisheries look at that information and really do a really deep dive analysis on the threats and the current viability, and the future viability of the species in light of these 5 factors here for the threats. That can include anything from sea level rise to water quality issues for some of our aquatics. Threats are endless. So once they do their review and come up with a determination, the result of that 12-month finding, or it's also called the status review, it's either not warranted, where they feel the species is not in danger of extinction now, or not at risk of becoming endangered in the foreseeable future. And another thing that can happen is that species can be considered not warranted because they're extinct. And so the little guy up at the top here, you guys probably know that species. That's our ivory-billed woodpecker. That one's currently going through a review right now to figure out if it should be declared extinct. It can also be warranted, but precluded, and that's what happened with the monarch. So it was, it should be listed, but they put it on this holding list for the candidate list. And if listing, of course, if listing is warranted, then it's either threatened or endangered. And then that's the 2 species on the right. I don't know if you guys can, there is no way, they're very, very difficult to tell apart, but these are actually 2 different species now. So we've got the alligator snapping turtle on the top and the Sewanee alligator snapping turtle on the bottom. And you should be seeing those 12-month findings in the next 8 months for those 2 species. That will, and we'll publish that and inform the public of the status of those species. We've got someone mentioned gopher tortoise. So yeah, the gopher tortoise is it's still on the candidate list, but only this on the map here, only the green section, that section of the range, they're the candidate population, whereas the ones over in Louisiana are actually considered endangered. So, and they just get put into a holding pattern until we're able to and prioritize. So because we have so many species, we have to consider. So once a species is proposed for listing as threatened or endangered, it's published in the Federal Register. Once that's published, the public can provide comments for up to 60 days after that proposal is published. You can also request a hearing or a public hearing if you feel like you're needing information, or maybe you have information that you want to share. You can request a public hearing within 45 days of that it's published. And this is the Canoe Creek Club shell. It's actually in Alabama. Here's another proposed species. This is slender claw crayfish, and the proposed species are given some protections. There's still, you still can't take, have to be careful. At least the federal agencies can't take these proposed species, but we do take that. During the time a species is proposed, we request information, and then we have 12 months after that is published to evaluate all that information that the public sends, or any new information that may come in during that 60-day period. And that can come through a few different avenues. And I have links at the end of this that you can explore. This is the black-capped petrel. Just recently, last week, a paper expanded its range to include the northern Gulf of Mexico. So these guys are right off the coast and you don't even know it. So they're seabirds that nest in the Caribbean, and they're pretty cool.
Hey, I have a couple of questions about terminology.
Yeah,
Um, so Stephen is asking, in terms of the monarch, you were using the term precluded.
that precluded is when we find sufficient evidence or information that a species is warranted, that it should be listed as either threatened or endangered, but we don't, but we're not prepared to actually put it on the list yet. Maybe we need more information. Maybe we need, uh, maybe there's higher priority species we have to get to. So precluded is a term that just means we're putting it on the candidate list. So it's warranted. Yes, it should be listed, but it's precluded. We're not going to be able to get to it right now. So we're going to put it on the candidate list.
Okay,
Those
thank you.
candidates get visited every year. So we're not just forgetting about them. They're there and we have to pay attention to them.
Thank you. And then another question from Joanne about the difference between state and federal threatened and endangered lists.
That's another good question. Some states defer to the federal protections, and some states have their own meaning of those terms. And so you'd have to go look on the regulations for the state. It's usually the Department of Natural Resources or Department of Fish and Wildlife. So you'd have to do a little checking to make sure, that that you can, it's different for every state. So, and some states don't even have their own list, so they just follow the federal.
Thank you.
Let's see, anything else?
That's
I
good.
know we're running out of time, and I'm going to go really quick. So once we get to with something is species is proposed for 12 months, then we do a final listing, and that also gets published. And so that goes into the Federal Register. And once it publishes as a final, then the listing becomes effective within 30 days after that publication, and the process stops. It's a listed species. It becomes a law. It becomes published in our Code of Federal Regulations. And there's no changing that until you go in and go through this process again and analyze and see if it's been recovered. Let's see here, a couple of other special rules, a couple of species that look nearly identical, pallid sturgeon and shovel-nosed sturgeon. Sometimes you get species that overlap and you really can't tell them apart. So you can write up a rule that provides protections for the one that's not threatened or endangered. But you don't want people still going after that species when they could accidentally affect, one of the less common ones. Critical habitat. I talked a little bit about the importance of that to species, and it's basically a tool. And if a species is listed as threatened or endangered, we try to propose the critical habitat concurrently with the listing. So that would be proposed at the same time. There's a little picture of some critical habitat for this little species. This particular one is off the coast of Alabama. There's some over in Mississippi as well. And this shows you what the critical habitat map looks like. This particular one is the Alabama beach mouse, who is endangered. And a couple of, the critical habitat, it does make sure that those federal agencies protect the habitat, but it does not affect private landowners, and it doesn't create sanctuaries. And this is that Code of Federal Regulations that I was referring to, that this is where all of our laws are. So the wildlife, the endangered and threatened wildlife is in the 50 Title 50 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and it's Part 17. So you can go in there at any time and see that list. and it changes all the time. So let's see, as of today, there were 24 threatened and endangered species in in Louisiana. And I know of a few that are coming off and a few that might be going on. So, if you guys pay attention, you'll start to see that. Here's one that's coming off next week, or in 10 days from now. This is the least turn, and it was recovered. It was listed. Wasn't doing well because of habitat loss, and some partnerships, everybody pulled together, worked together, and helped get the species off the list. And so it was just the final delisting rule for this species just published a few weeks ago, and that will officially be off the list. I believe it's February 13th or 12th. So the interior least turn. So that's exciting. Just a quick review of the process. You put in a petition, do the 90-day finding, do the 12-month finding. And at that time, you figure out if you're going to propose to list or it's not warranted. And all those green stars I have on here, those are where you can and the public can be involved in the process. And so it can sometimes be circular. If you get in listed species and you're doing the 5-year reviews, you'll go through this process and evaluate the species. But there's public opportunity. Or here I have on the threatened and endangered species list, there were 942 plants across the country. Well, that's across. We also do international listings too. So I'm not sure if that was just in the US or included international. 713 animals and 28 species that were proposed for listing. I talked about all that work we have to do and all those species that are piled up. So now we have what's called the work plan that's published, and you guys can go and visit this work plan and see some species. It tells the public what we're going to be working on for the next 5 years. We actually have an internal work plan that goes out to 2033, I think. So it just never ends, but we're doing the best we can. And I took a look at that list so you guys could have an idea of what's coming up. You should be in, and we're a government agency, so we work on fiscal years, which means the end of the year is the last day of September of each year. So this year you should be seeing these top 3 species published with some sort of results from their 12-month finding. And then the next year, by September 30th of 2022, you should see the 12-month finding for the species on the bottom here. So it's exciting. There's some stuff happening. And I did include some links here. I was hoping to have some chances to walk through these, but you guys can do it on your own. Your closest Louisiana Fish and Wildlife Service field office is in Lafayette, so you can go to their website. You can go to our Fish and Wildlife Service Endangered website. ECOS is our it's kind of our depository of all of our T&E species and information about them. And that's a great place it's called ECOS, ECOS. You can go and find species profiles, look at any petitions or previous actions. You can also pull up any lists according to like your parish or your state. So that's a fun place to go explore. The Federal Register is where all that information gets published. And so, and then regulations.gov is where you can submit your comments. If you read one of our documents in the Federal Register, you could submit a response to that. It could even be, hey, I love American bumblebees. We take any responses, but we typically only respond to the substantive comments that provide information on the species. but we like any kind of comments. So so if you guys ever wanted to take a look at the Federal Register and regulations.gov, you have an opportunity to participate. And of course, our laws go into the Code of Federal Regulations. I'm sorry I'm going over you guys. And you can always contact me. So I've got my email on here. You can reach out to me with any questions. And I'm happy to be here tonight. I'm happy to talk to you guys further if you have additional questions. And this is my class of Master Naturalists from several years ago that I still, it's great to see all of you participating in this. And I wish you all the best. Are there any questions?
Yes, so we do have a couple of questions. One was about the ranges. So Steve wants to know, are natural ranges split up based on distinct populations, and roughly how is that determined if the populations are contiguous?
That is a good question. So ranges are typically based on, and it can be tricky because sometimes you have species that are migratory, like the piping plovers and the red knots and the migratory whooping cranes, and it's hard to figure out where they're going to be. So those ranges typically come from occurrence data, like where the species has been found. And some of those range occurrences go back even centuries, especially if it's a rare species, you might include a part of the range where the species was seen 200 years ago. But it's very dynamic. Those ranges can shift. Populations are another thing, like populations within the ranges. We define those in a lot of different ways, depending on the available science. It could be based on genetics, if there's a genetic difference between one area or another, if there's maybe a dam blocking connectivity between two sections of a river, we may call those multiple populations, especially if they've been separated over time. Did that answer the question?
I think so. I think
Okay.
it's a complex issue is what you're saying.
It's species specific, right? And it's all based on the best available science. And that's what those are our standards we have to apply. And if you're interested, you can always look at some of these rules that we've published and look at the various meanings of range and populations and those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I had two questions. This is the last question that I'm going to ask about the green anole, because we observe a lot of competition between the green anole and the Cuban brown anole.
Let's see. The green anole is native. Is that? It's
Yes.
not native, right? It is native?
Somebody chime in if you know different. Mary, I think the green anole.
I think the green is native and the Cuban is not.
Right.
That's correct.
That is correct.
If it is not currently on our list that I'm aware of species for us to evaluate, but if someone is concerned enough about it and you guys have enough evidence, anyone can submit a petition on that, and we would have to look at it and figure out if that's truly a threat. It could get put on the endangered species list. So, that's we get petitions from all walks of life, just people who care about the species and also people who have spent their whole life, studying it. And so if you have the information and you felt that it was supported, we would definitely take a look at it.
So that's a great opportunity for someone to earn a lot of hours this year. Okay, you've had lots of comments saying thank you, how well organized and interesting the talk was tonight. I really appreciate you taking your time to join us and present this interesting information to us. Thank you so much.